Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
Hugo lived alone. He had no family, no real friends, not even a pet. Monday through Friday, he went to work at the office as an accountant. Every day he added columns of numbers, and once every 2 weeks he made out the paychecks for the company. That was the closest he'd ever come to the other employees, typing their names on a paycheck. Hugo spent the weekends alone. On Saturdays he watched television, and he carefully read through every piece of junk mail that he received during the week. Hugo always answered the ads for free information. On Sundays he read the newspaper and took a walk. He didn't mind living such a solitary life. He didn't like people, really. But sometimes Hugo could tell when he had been alone too long. Sometimes when he had to talk to someone, his voice sounded like a stranger's. When that happened, he would make a point of eating out in a restaurant. He would ask the waitress questions and listen to what other people were saying, and that usually got him back to normal. One Monday morning, Hugo woke up at exactly 7:30 as he did every other morning. It had been a 3-day weekend because of a holiday on Friday. Hugo had not left his apartment for 3 days. The weather had been too bad to take a walk on Sunday, so he had stayed in to watch television and read the papers. Hugo groaned and stumbled out of bed. His head felt groggy this morning. He went into the bathroom and turned on the cold water. Then he splashed his face with the water to try and clear his head. But he still felt strange. After he dried his face, Hugo looked in the mirror. He always did that in the morning. Hugo looked in the mirror for a long time this morning. He didn't seem to be thinking straight, and what he saw in the mirror didn't make sense. He stared straight into the reflection of his eyes. Then he looked at his nose, his mouth, his forehead. The more he looked at himself, the more it seemed that he was looking at the face of a stranger. "That's not me," he thought to himself. "That can't be me." But as he moved his face up and down, the reflection also moved up and down. Hugo shut his eyes and shook his head back and forth. Then he looked at the mirror again. The stranger's face hadn't gone away. It was staring right back at him. "My God," said Hugo. He put his hands to his face, and it did the same. Suddenly he needed to know if he was still himself. He ran to the closet. His clothes were all neatly hung in rows, arranged according to color. He pulled open a dresser drawer. His wallet was there, and his driver's license still had his name on it. Hugo sighed with relief. Then he looked up at the mirror over the dresser. The stranger was looking back at him. "That isn't me," Hugo said in a trembling voice. "I don't look like that." Hugo dressed himself in one of his oldest suits, one that he had worn hundreds of times. It made him feel secure. Then he went into the kitchen, put on some coffee, and poured himself a bowl of cereal. As he picked up the big spoon, he saw the stranger's distorted face staring at him, upside down. "I don't look like that," Hugo repeated. Suddenly, he thought of a way to prove it. A picture, he thought. There must be a picture of me. But he couldn't think of any. No one had ever taken a picture of him that he could remember. He began to shake inside. There had to be a way to prove that he was not the stranger that he saw reflected in the mirror. By now it was 8:15. He would have to be at his desk in 45 minutes. Hugo didn't know what to do. He couldn't go into his office looking like a stranger, but he couldn't stay home either. It was the 15th of the month. The employees were supposed to get their checks today. Hugo got ready to go to the office. He avoided looking in any mirrors. As he locked the door to his apartment, his neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, passed him on the street. "Good morning, Hugo," she said, and Hugo returned her greeting. Then he realized what it meant. He looked like his old self to her. He almost went back to the apartment to check the mirror again, but then he remembered that there was a mirror at the front of the bus that he would ride to the office. He walked to the bus stop and waited, humming a song. He felt better now. The bus pulled up and Hugo walked on. As he gave the driver his money, he stooped to look in the mirror. To his horror, the stranger stared back, with an eager grin on his face. Hugo slumped into a seat. He rode all the way to his office with his eyes shut. There was a window by his seat, and every time he looked at it, the reflection of the stranger's face was there. At 9 o'clock, Hugo was in his office at his desk. He sat there, waiting for someone to notice, but no one did. The women who worked in the accounts department with him acted perfectly normal. They paid no more attention to him than they usually did. Hugo felt as though he were going mad. 4 times during the day he went to the restroom to check. The mirror always confirmed his fears, that he looked like a total stranger, and no one even noticed. Hugo went home that night and went directly to bed. He hid in the dark bedroom until sleep put his exhausted mind to rest. When he woke the next morning, he was afraid to look in the mirror. He avoided it, but he had to shave if he went to work. It was hard shaving the stranger's face. His hands were shaking. It went like that Tuesday morning and Wednesday morning and Thursday morning. Friday morning, Hugo woke up at 7:15 and lay in bed for a very long time. He didn't want to get up. He felt as though he couldn't go on living with that stranger's face. He stayed in the bedroom for an hour. Finally, the fear of being alone with the face all day forced him out of bed. He decided he would go to work, even though he was late. He went to the bathroom and began to shave automatically. Then he dropped the razor. It was his old face, his own face back in the mirror again. Hugo ran his hands all over his face. It really was him. This was how he looked. He let out a crazy laugh. The stranger had gone, disappeared, and he was himself again. Hugo finished shaving, dressed, and rushed out of the house without having breakfast. He was eager to get to work now, eager to have people see him. As he was locking the front door, Mrs. Reynolds passed by on the street. She looked at him suspiciously and didn't say good morning, but Hugo was too happy to notice that she was acting strangely. He sprang up the steps into the bus and handed the driver his money. Stooping down, he saw his own face smiling back at him in the driver's mirror. On the ride to the office, he would turn to the window every few minutes. He wanted constant reassurance that his face would be there in the reflection, and it always was. At 9:30, Hugo pushed open the door to the accounts department. The receptionist was calling to him from her desk in the hallway, but he didn't pay attention. He just wanted to get to his desk because he was late. Hugo strode across the room to his desk, which sat in a corner. He put his briefcase on the desk and sat down in his chair. He noticed the constant sound of typing in the room had stopped. Now there was no sound at all, as a matter of fact. Hugo smiled as he saw Miss Rose, the head clerk, walking toward his desk. "Yes, Miss Rose," he said. Miss Rose stopped a few feet from his desk. "Who are you?" she asked. Hugo laughed at the joke. Miss Rose was being especially friendly today. "Why are you sitting in Hugo's desk?" Miss Rose demanded. And Hugo stopped laughing. He looked into Miss Rose's eyes. The truth crept like a sinister madman into his mind. Miss Rose was looking at a total stranger. He could see that she didn't recognize him. Hugo gripped both sides of the desk. "Who are you?" Miss Rose repeated. But Hugo didn't answer. His mind was too busy, making its strange, spiraling descent into total madness. Many people have a phobia, an unnatural fear they can't control. But Ellen's phobia bordered on the fringe of madness. She would go into hysteria even at the sight of a small field mouse. Perhaps she had a right to be afraid, after what happened that night. It was late when Ellen left the small restaurant where she had eaten dinner alone. The restaurant stood on one side of the large city park, and because it was a warm summer night, Ellen decided to walk through the park to her apartment on the other side. She started down a path overhung by leafy trees. It was surprisingly dark on the path, dark enough to make Ellen feel uneasy. She quickened her pace, thinking she should get to the other side of the park as soon as possible. She had heard stories about things, unpleasant things, that happened to people in the park at night. Then, coming out of the shaded path into an open area, she saw the sky was still light. She decided to walk a little slower, but she couldn't completely forget her uneasiness, or the stories. She walked on through the park toward the lake in the middle. Soon another path loomed ahead, shaded by thick trees. Ellen looked in the distance down the path. No one seemed to be on it. She looked behind her, wondering if she should turn back around. But by now she had walked into the center of the park. There was no point in turning back. Once on the shaded path, she could hear no sounds but the rustle of leaves. The sounds of the city were drowned out here. Ellen walked on, listening to the leaves whispering in the night air. She felt as though she were 1,000 miles from civilization. But then her ears picked up another sound. It wasn't a sound from the city outside, and it wasn't a sound from the trees either. She listened to her own footsteps on the cement path, and told herself that was all she had heard. But no, she heard it again, an echo of her own footsteps behind her. She was sure of it now. There were other footsteps following her. Fear crept into her mind. It made her heart pound and her legs walk faster. Soon Ellen knew she had reason to be afraid. The footsteps behind were keeping pace with hers. They had quickened with her own. She kept herself from running, knowing she must not show her fear. She knew she must stay in control of herself. Forcing her legs to slow down, she realized the footsteps behind her were not slowing down. They came up from behind, quickly, eagerly. Ellen couldn't control her fear any longer. She broke into a run down the path. The footsteps didn't follow right away, but then, over the pounding of her heart, she heard them hitting the pavement, fast and steady. Ahead, Ellen saw the path that went down to the lake. She knew that people more often came to the lake than any other place in the park. She ran down a small hill toward the lake. As she rounded a corner, her heart sank. The path by the lake was deserted too, and now the footsteps behind her were coming down the hill and were catching up to her. Ellen looked around wildly. There was a dense area of bushes and trees to her left. She ran on for a few steps and then threw herself into hiding in the bushes. Maybe, she prayed, the footsteps would go by. It was dark now. Only a half-moon penetrated the night with its mellow light. Ellen heard the footsteps first. Then she saw the shadow that belonged to them. The man stopped walking 20 feet from where she was hiding. He stood silent for a minute with his back to her. Then he walked over to a bench at the lake's edge and sat down on it. In the bushes, Ellen was sweating. She wondered why she had ever stopped running. Nothing could be worse than this. The man must know she was hiding. Was he going to wait it out until she couldn't stand to hide any longer? Then Ellen thought that others might come along on the path. She would have to jump out of the bushes then and could walk out of the park with them. She looked over at the man on the bench again. He sat calmly looking out at the lake. Something caught her eye. There was a small shadow moving along the water's edge. It stopped. Silhouetted against the night sky, Ellen could see the head of a large rat. She started to get up off the ground. That was always her reaction to mice, to stand on a chair, to get up off the floor in any way possible. But now, she couldn't get up, and she couldn't let loose the scream choking in her throat. As if in a bad nightmare, 3 more rats joined the one by the lake. Ellen could see their fat shadows and their ugly rodent heads in the moonlight, and she could hear the clatter of their claws on the cement path. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but the bigger shadow on the bench scared her more. The rats not more than 5 feet away from him. He must see them, Ellen thought. She switched her eyes back to the rats. They hypnotized her with loathing fear. She heard a rustle in the bushes, not more than 2 feet from her. She had to gag her mouth with her sweater to keep from screaming. What if a rat came up to her? What if it jumped on her with its sharp claws? Then, with horror, Ellen saw that the 4 rats by the lake's edge were coming toward her. Their sharp rodent noses were pointing at her. Their long tails were switching back and forth. Ellen screamed. She saw the shadow on the bench stand up. It started to come at her toward the bushes. She struggled to her feet. As she took a step backwards, her foot fell into a deep hole. It was a rat's nest. Dozens of baby rats squealed in panic and crawled out of the hole around her foot. They were everywhere, scuttling away in desperation. Ellen jerked her foot out of the hole. As she stepped back again, her foot landed on the soft body of a baby rat. It squealed in agony, and Ellen screamed and screamed again. Then Ellen saw the shadow of the man moving closer and closer to her. She struggled to get out of the bushes, although her knees were weak with fear. Finally, she pushed her way through the thick branches and stepped onto the path going back up to the hill. The man had seen her. He came nearer. There in the pale moonlight, Ellen saw his face. Her body was filled with revulsion. It was the face of a huge rat, its whiskers twitching. Ellen ran. Terror, mindless terror, carried her down the path out of the park. She did not hear footsteps following behind her. All she heard was the high, unnatural squealing of rats. Ellen ran on and on until she finally escaped from the park. But the rat, she would never really escape him. He was still there, in her mind.